we're in the second chapter, the third Mishnah. I hope you have a text in front of you because we are going to refer to some of the nuances of the text, so it's useful to have it in front of you. Also, tonight's Shiur is dedicated to the refuah shlema of Moshe Michael ben Tema Leah. That is Michael Wexler, my mechutan and good friend as well, good friend of Kesher also, and we wish him refuah shlema. Okay, our Mishnah for tonight deals with a particular theme. So whereas last week's Mishnah was compound, but tonight's one message, and we'd like to look at it in the context, look at it in a historical context, look at it from a midrashic or a homiletic point of view as well, and hopefully we can learn quite a lot in the process. So the Mishnah says, Hevu zehirin b'rishus, be wary of rulers. The word rishus, rishus means the one in charge, the authority. She'ein makarvin lo la'adam, because the authorities only befriend a person ela letzorach atzman, for their own benefit. Nirin ka'ohavim b'shas hana'asan, they appear to be friendly, to be almost like have an affection for the individual, or maybe for the Jewish people, when they, that is to say, the rulers stand to benefit from it. Vein omdin lola adam, but they do not stand behind a man b'shas dachko, in his time of need. In a way, we might suggest that this Mishnah doesn't really require much commentary. Even if you think about it just for a moment, we can all appreciate the wisdom of it, but we'd like to explore it, as we always do, in a deeper way. So the classic Mishnah commentator, Rabbi Ovadia Bartanura, he puts it in the context of the Mishnah that preceded it. So if you have the text again, take a look at the Mishnah immediately preceding it. And there we learned in the second half of that Mishnah, those who occupy themselves with the needs of the community, they should do so for the sake of heaven. And we explained that in detail last week. From within that context, Bartanura says that having taught just in the previous Mishnah that those who are involved in the betterment of the community, looking after the needs of the community, advancing the needs of the community, should do so l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And in that context, we have the warning, by the way, be careful about your relationships with the ruling authority. Beware, don't put too much hope or too much stock, don't rely on them to too great an extent. There's a certain recognition that the nature of communal advocacy almost of necessity involves interaction and seeking to build bridges and even acquire a sort of close relationship with the ruling authorities. That's the way to advance the needs, or to protect the needs, or to defend the Jewish community against malefactors. But nevertheless, it comes with a warning: be careful, be cautious, recognize the limitations of the affection or the protection of the authorities and the authoritarian, the rulers of the particular context or government. So that's the context in terms of the Mishnah, that its context within the sequence of the Mishnayos. Looking at it in historical context, who is the speaker here? The Mishnah doesn't identify him, but there's a presumption that he is the same one who was quoted in the previous Mishnah, and that was Rabban Gamliel. If you look at the Mishnah immediately preceding, Rabban Gamliel beno Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi Omer. Rabban Gamliel, who was the son of Rabbi Yehuda the prince. So we mentioned last week and in detail the week before, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the great leader of the Jewish people, the great rabbinic authority, but also the temporal authority, the political leader. He also was a person of great wealth, great prestige. He was a great statesman. And I think we mentioned in that context that he even was known, the Talmud relates in a few places, that he was known to have a good collegial relationship with Antoninus. Antoninus is identified as the Roman, either the Roman emperor or the Roman governor of what was then Judea, in the land of Israel. In terms of actually identifying who was this Antoninus, so there are different opinions among the historians. He may well have been Marcus Aurelius, Some of the authorities, Rappaport and others, suggest that Antoninus was Marcus Aurelius, the famous Roman ruler. So if that is the case, then Rabban Gamliel, as the son of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, is speaking from experience. He's speaking from what he saw in his father's own household, where his father indeed had that close relationship, and the Jewish community no doubt benefited from it. Nevertheless, the limitations, the caution, the recognition that they won't necessarily stand by your side in a time of need. And of course, this is true in the electoral cycle as well, even within a democracy, perhaps especially in a democracy where the politician who's running for office will curry favor with the Jewish community and every other community seeking votes, but whether the promises and the policy platform will be honored after he's in office is another matter entirely. To put it in a further historical context, I began by saying that this Mishnah is really self-explanatory. The wisdom of it and the prudence of the advice doesn't require much elaboration. But if we think even in Jewish history, I'll mention 3 examples, probably all of which are known to all of us here on this little Zoom Shiur. The first one is the biblical example of Yosef HaTzadik, the great son of Yaakov, one of the 12 sons of Yaakov, Joseph, who was sold into slavery, but he rose to great and high office. He was the viceroy, he was the savior of Egypt, he was respected, maybe beloved by Paro, and presumably appreciated by all of Egypt. Certainly the Torah implies that that was the case. And as we very well know, by the time Yosef died, a generation or 2 later, the Jewish people, his own grandchildren, were subject to the writ of in slavery. I don't know whether it was written down, but anyway, the decree of slavery. So one sees how the Egyptian authorities, within a short period of time, a generation or 2, completely turned around and turned against Yosef and his family. Another example, famous example in medieval times, is Don Isaac Abarbanel. I hope you have heard of him. He was the treasurer of Ferdinand and Isabella. He was a very influential, very wise, very respected, very important player, actually, contributed to the success and to the expansion of the Spanish Empire. And nevertheless, when the decision or the writ of expulsion, and that was a writ, in fact, it's been preserved, it's known as the Alhambra Declaration, when it was promulgated in March of 1492, to go into effect on the 31st of July, 1492, Abarbanel had to hit the road with all the rest of the Jewish exiles, leaving behind his fortune, his prestige, and everything else. Again, an example of how his contribution to the betterment of the country was completely spurned. But I want to mention a final example, just because, as I'm sure you all know, I have a fondness or maybe a weakness for history. I also want to mention FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of the United States during the Depression. He's credited with dragging the country out of the Depression. And of course, he was the president in the White House at the time of World War II and the Holocaust years. He was greatly venerated by the Jews. He was considered the great white father. The Jews thought that he was their only hope. And he touted his Jewish connections. Stephen Wise, a very important Reform rabbi at the time, Judge Samuel Rosenman, who was the first ever White House counsel. He was a Democratic activist. He was a speechwriter for Roosevelt. He is the one who coined the phrase, and he was the architect of the New Deal. For those who know about it, if you don't know about it, speak to Dr. Schmidt. He wrote his dissertation about a related aspect of that. So so Roosevelt was a great friend of the Jews, and yet when it came down to taking action to obstruct the Holocaust, the Nazi program of genocide, he was very slow to act. He didn't really take much interest at all. It became apparent subsequently after the war and after his death that he actually didn't care for Jews very much at all. And just for further research, I'll just mention 3 books have been written on the subject. The first one was written already in the 1960s. The others are more recent, but the titles of these 3 books already revealed the subject. One was called While 6 Million Died. Another was called Thy Brother's Blood. Another one is called Auschwitz and the Allies, and these are all historical books that trace the shameful record of Roosevelt in essentially ignoring the death of millions of Jews. It wasn't quite so simple. I don't want to completely, trivialize the matter, but I do feel that it is an illustration, a very poignant and very tangible illustration of the warning of our Mishnah that it is very short-sighted to put great hope and great expectations in the friendship that one may have with political personalities. Okay, that's just by way of historical perspective. Turning now again to the Mishnah in the context of Pirkei Avot, so the Medrash Shmuel makes an observation which others have made as well, other of the commentators as well. If you turn back to chapter 1, Mishnah 10. So in that Mishnah, in the previous parak, in the first chapter, so Mishnah 10, there we find Shmaya va'avtalion, and Shmaya says as follows: Ehaves hamelacha, love labor or work. Usnas harabanut, despise positions of power. V'altis vada l'reshus, and do not become overly familiar with the government. Altis vada l'reshus. So Shemaiah, speaks or writes in very strong language. Love work, despise authority or positions of prestige or influence, and do not get familiar with the government. Keep your distance from Rishus. Whereas our Mishnah, interestingly, is evidently, Rabban Gamliel evidently means to clarify or add to or modify each of those 3 statements. So Shmaya said, Ehovas HaMalacha, you should love work or labor. We learned in last week's Mishnah, although it was the first half of last week's Mishnah, which was therefore the week before, he said, Yafet Torah im derech eretz, that Torah and a livelihood, that's a good combination. So whereas Shmaya said, love work, Rabban Gamliel says, well, work is very useful, maybe essential, but it works best. That is to say, it's going to be effective and bring a person to his fulfillment when it's together with Torah. Don't just devote all of your energies and interest to work. It has to be joined together with Torah. With regard to the statement about hating authority, hating rabbanut, hating sort of position, what did we render? This said positions of power. So we learned again in last week's Mishnah, the second half of last week's Mishnah, which we did last week, because the first part we did the week before, but we learned last week about those who involve themselves with tzarchei tzibur, chol ha'oskim im hatzibur. So whereas Shmaya said, don't seek a position of power within the Jewish community, Rabban Gamliel says, actually, it's highly meritorious to do so, but do it l'shem shamayim, do it for the sake of heaven, do it for the right motivation and for the right aspiration, not for your own aggrandizement. And finally, which is our Mishnah that we're doing right now, whereas Shmaya said, don't become familiar with the government, don't kind of cozy up to the governmental authorities, our Mishnah here says, there may be a place for it. If you're going to be an activist, if you're going to be an advocate, if you're going to be a communal leader, you will very likely have to do exactly that, but just be cautious, beware, be be alert and be conscious of the limitations and maybe even the dangers. I'm just enjoying seeing Raphael's face appear because he's on our Zoom Shiur. Raphael Zweigenbaum, just for anyone who doesn't know, his father was one of those communal activists, not only within his own community, but really within all of the European community and even worldwide. And certainly, if he were here, sadly passed away last year, but if he were with us, he could, I'm sure, enlighten us with many examples of how one has to be cautious in cultivating relations with the governmental authorities, but at the same time recognizing the value and the importance of doing exactly that. It's like many things in life, it's a matter of balance. So Rabban Gamaliel warns us against the limitations of it. I want to just take that a little bit further because I know I've mentioned a couple of times in the past that I'm using this season. One of the commentaries that I'm consulting is that of Rabbi David Pinto. I hope that many of you will remember him. Rabbi Pinto comes to London normally once a year, sometimes more, and he comes to Kesher. Rabbi Pinto is the scion of a very distinguished rabbinic dynasty from Morocco, and he lived much of his life in France. He now lives in Israel, and he's a global Torah activist, and he comes to London. He's also renowned as a Kabbalist and as a very wise and astute person. The reason I tell you about his background will become apparent in one moment. So he wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avos, and I have a copy of it. I think he gave me a copy when he was here on one occasion. And he writes the following. He says that a person who has the need to cultivate a relationship on behalf of the Jewish community with the governmental authorities should try to do so without drawing attention to himself. In other words, he shouldn't recognize or somehow see this as an opportunity to advance his own personal agenda, his own aggrandizement, to somehow profit from the relationship which he is developing with powerful and influential governmental statesmen or authorities. He shouldn't sort of revel in being the celebrity rabbi and the names that he can drop, and he can say, well, when I was with this senator last week and the previous month I was in the Knesset speaking to them about whatever it was, and then I was in the Westminster, in the House of Lords also with meeting some of my friends. A person who kind of glories in the limelight and in the fame and the renown, that is not the way to go about it. That's what the Tana here is warning, that you'll only get burned. And I don't want to mention, there's a certain rabbi in America, used to live in England for a certain time, who's known as America's rabbi. He styles himself that way. And it's very easy to get the feeling that he somehow is equally interested in advancing his own renown as he is in benefiting the Jewish community. I just want to say, though, that Rabbi Pinto himself, I believe, and I have gotten to know him fairly well, fulfills his own interpretation in saying that a person who's getting to know the governmental authorities as someone who's osek b'tzarchei tzibur should do so in a way which limits his own fame, which doesn't sort of advance his personal profile, but rather that of the cause. Rabbi Pinto is quite close with the King of Morocco when Rabbi Pinto goes every year to the Hilula for his father, and he visits the cemetery. So the King of Morocco is often there himself, and if not, he sends a representative, and he has earned great respect within the governmental authorities in Morocco. He's also a very good friend of Jared Kushner, and you can Google it afterwards if you want to see some YouTube clips about it on the news and that sort of thing. But he himself, Rabbi Pinto, is always very modest about it, always downplays those relationships, even though it's reasonable to imagine that because Jared Kushner is in such a pivotal position within the structure of the American governmental setup, at least for a few more months. Probably Rabbi Pinto's relationship with him, I would expect, would have a favorable sort of influence on that. But Rabbi Pinto himself downplays that, to the full extent. I just want to suggest another angle to this as well, because actually Rabbi Pinto writes that if a person is able to do so, if his advocacy for the Jewish community does not necessitate currying favor with the authorities and does not necessitate seeking the input or the largesse of the governmental authorities, that's all the better. It's best to avoid that to the extent that it can be done. If not, then approach with caution. And I remember that my good friend Bensi Dunner, my late friend Bensi Dunner, was very involved with one of the schools, actually with several of the schools, of the Jewish schools in our community. And during those days, the holy grail of Jewish schools was to get state aid. It meant an enormous difference to their budget. It had great financial implications. And many Jewish schools, including some very fine Jewish schools, I mean, they're all fine, I'm sure, but I mean to say even some that are more within the sort of Torah realm, I'm saying those that have a strong emphasis on a Torah aspect of the education, many of those schools have managed to receive state aid by fulfilling various requirements and ensuring that they teach a certain curriculum. And that is a very worthwhile thing. And I have to say that as a parent who paid tuition for all of my children over many years, those that went to schools that were state aided definitely benefited, and I, as a fee-paying parent, benefited from that. Nevertheless, and this is what Bensi said, he said, I wonder if we may come to regret it one day. We're going to such effort and we're using every method that we have to seek to earn the status of state aid so that the government will help to offset the cost of the education and pay for the building and all other kinds of great things. But he said it always comes with a price. It always comes with consequences. It comes with governmental oversight. And although he died about 10 or 12 years ago, long before the current Ofsted regime, which is causing such grief to many Jewish schools, but I wonder what he would think of it right now, because there's those schools which are independent, although they are also subject to governmental oversight, but to a much lesser extent. And of course, there's a reason why all of those schools sought state aid, which I already mentioned. Is quite obvious, the great financial benefit. And yet I read in the newspaper just the other day that there's a new college at Oxford, the first in 30 years, and it's called the Reuben College. And they have named the college in honor of the Reuben brothers, who made a donation in the tune, I don't know if anyone saw the same news item, 80 million pounds to Oxford University, to name a college Reuben College. Now, my point is simply to illustrate that there is enough money, there's enough wealth within the Jewish community, enough philanthropy, that if those funds were directed to Jewish causes and Jewish schools, that it would have been possible for Jewish schools to flourish without the need for the governmental sort of engagement and the consequences that go with it. Okay, it's all a bit in the realm of the theory, because the Reuben brothers, two Jewish boys from Bombay, have given their money to Oxford, not to Jewish schools, although they did endow Nancy Reuben School, which I don't know whether anyone in this Zoom call is involved with that school, but definitely a number of families at Kesher have sent their children to the school and have benefited from it. So I'm not saying that the Reuben brothers have completely forgotten their Jewish roots as well. I'm just mentioning that in some cases, it's possible to achieve the betterment of the community without becoming dependent on the affection and the largesse of the governmental authorities. And let's not even contemplate what would have happened if the Labour government under Comrade Jeremy Corbyn had come into power. That doesn't even bear contemplation. Okay, that's enough, I think, to illustrate the wisdom of the sages in urging, counseling, caution with regard to reliance on governmental authority. Ad kan al derech hapshat. We discussed the Mishnah in terms of its evident, apparent meaning within the context, within a bit of history, etc. However, there's another approach which I found in a few of the Mefarshim, al derech ha-medrash, a drash, a homiletic interpretation, which I would very much like to share with you, and so I'm going to do that. The word reshus, I told you, means authority. Hevu zehirin bereshus. Now, if you look closely to the way it's spelled with a kamatz under the base and a kamatz under the resh, barashus. But the word reshus, if it's spelled with a kamatz under the resh, I hope I'm not making you crazy by taking you back to cheder with the names of the vowels. If it's spelled with a kamatz bereshus, then it means with permission, which is related to the word authority because those concepts are closely related. But it can be interpreted, and it is interpreted by a number of the Mefarshim in a homiletic way, to mean the following: Have a zehirin bereshus, be cautious regarding things which are permissible. Regarding things which are permissible. What caution does one need to exercise regarding things which are permissible? And of course, what they are all referring to, although some mention this by name and some do not, but what they are all referring to is the idea which is articulated so forcefully and cogently by Ramban in the first in his comments to at the beginning of Parshas Kedoshim. The Torah says, Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy. Says Ramban, the Torah that is instructing us to be holy, the intention is, and this is the famous turn of phrase Ramban uses, Kadesh atzmecha b'mutar lach. Sanctify yourself regarding that which is permissible to you. The Torah forbids certain behaviors which are clearly immoral, or perhaps they're not immoral, but they're not objectively immoral, but the Torah forbids them for a Jew to wear shatnez, a garment of wool and linen, or to eat meat and milk that are cooked together, and other behaviors, of course, which the Torah forbids. There's other behavior which the Torah enjoins. But says Ramban, it doesn't mean that everything which is permitted a person can pursue and a person can indulge himself in all of those permitted activities without any limitation. Such behavior is going to bring a person to debasement. Such behavior, says Ramban, is going to violate what the Torah says in Parshas Kedoshim, Kedoshim to you, you shall be holy. So have a zahirin bereshus, be cautious, be careful, be alert to the pitfall of indulging in behavior which even is permissible. If a person accustoms himself to indulgence, even in permissible areas, it can lead him to forbidden behavior as well. The act of indulging oneself and indulging one's appetites, even in a manner which strictly speaking is permissible, but by doing it to excess, by doing it with abandon, by doing it in a way that leads one to self-indulgence, will ultimately bring a person to behavior which is forbidden, and even the indulgence itself may be forbidden in its own right. Now, I wouldn't say on my own authority, even though I've elaborated a bit on the idea of Ramban, I wouldn't have said the following on my own authority, but I saw it in the Medrash Shmuel, and he says, I don't know whether he's quoting a Medrash or it's just sort of his own imagination, but anyway, it doesn't come from me. He says that David HaMelech, King David, he was a warrior, he was a hero, he was a king, he was a ruler, he was a righteous person, he was a holy person, he wrote Tehillim, he was a person of great spiritual capability, but he also had weaknesses, as all human beings do, and King David certainly had them as well, some of which are on display because they are described in the book of Samuel, the book of Kings. Maybe his most well-known weakness was for women. And again, I'm not just making it up. It's what it says in the text itself. And the Medrash Shmuel says that David HaMelech had, a strong sexual appetite. And he had lots of wives, which was permitted for a king in those days. He had quite a few wives, and he had a few concubines as well on the side. Says the Medrash Shmuel, he indulged his conjugal impulse with his wives and with his concubines, all of which, strictly speaking, is permitted. And nevertheless, that indulgence did not prevent him from having an insatiable attraction to Bathsheba. When he saw this woman Bathsheba who was bathing and he spied her from the palace, he was overcome with a desire for her, and ultimately that led him to a very unsafe place, unsafe in the moral sense, for which he was rebuked by the prophet. And even though the rabbis say his transgression was not one of outright adultery, but it was definitely first cousin to it, if not even a closer relationship than that. So the Medrash Shmuel says this is an example where through the pursuit of fulfillment and personal gratification that was strictly speaking permissible, but through that kind of excessive indulgence, it led him to that which is forbidden. And as I said, that's how the Medrash Shmuel renders it. But I want to also share with you, possibly to my mind, the most compelling example of this thought in the writings of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Tursky. And he says, I'll just read a few lines from his book. One might remember that he was still is, although he's retired now, Susan Gesund, a very distinguished and accomplished psychiatrist who founded a rehabilitation center and who worked with, over the course of his career, probably certainly hundreds, more likely thousands of recovering alcoholics and drug addicts and others. And so with that in mind, he writes the following: one might think that earthly pleasures are one's best friends since they provide gratification, but their love is treacherous. This is how he's interpreting our Mishnah. Be cautious about things which are permissible, because they only draw a person near for their own benefit, and they seem to love you, but actually they'll love you and leave you. They won't stand by you in your time of need. So he writes, one might think that earthly pleasures are one's best friends since they provide gratification, but their love is treacherous. If we become dependent on them for our gratification, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. And he writes as follows: a young man in treatment for drug addiction wrote a letter to drugs in which he said, you promised me everything. You gave me great pleasure, but you were slyly ensnaring me. Instead of everything you promised, you took everything away from me. I lost my wife, my children, my job, my health, and the respect of my friends. While permissible pleasures may not be as overtly dangerous as drugs, they are nevertheless not without risk. People who become addicted to food or to making money may admit they have lost control. They may acknowledge that they have suffered harmful consequences from what began as apparent proper behavior, but accelerated beyond their control. We can thus understand the Mishnah: be cautious about permissible things. They are brought within one's reach in order to meet one's actual needs. They appear to be friendly, but they will not help a person when he is distressed. So I think this is a very relevant and, to my mind, a moving application, although a midrashic interpretation of our Mishnah, which, as I say, is found in a number of the commentaries that I've consulted in preparing for this year. But there's more, because there's another approach also, and this I saw in Irving Bunam's book, Ethics from Sinai. He says the word rishus can also be understood from the word rishayon. Rishayon means permit. And again, it's the same concept: permissible, permission, authority. Rishayon means a permit to do something. He says, if you are osek b'tzarchei tzibur, if you are fulfilling the second half of the Mishnah from last week, the Mishnah that says that those who involve themselves in the needs of the community should do so l'shem shamayim. He said that the Mishnah, our Mishnah, is urging caution in the following way. Let's say a person is a communal leader, communal activist, and he wants to make the world a better place. He wants to benefit the community, the Jewish community, and he is spearheading a project for communal benefit, a building, a school, a shul, another campaign, and Baruch Hashem, our community is blessed with people like that. So says Irving Bunim's interpretation of our Mishnah, be careful that when you're working for the tzibur, l'tzorchei tzibur, verify your mandate and your authorization. Have a zehirin bereshus, be sure that you've got the authorization to do the project that you're undertaking. Because if you succeed in the project, someone else will take credit for it. But if you fail, then people will say, who authorized you to do this in the first place? So therefore, he says, Zehirin Bereshus, be sure you get permission, whether planning permission, or governmental permission, or authority mandate, even from the community itself. Your zeal for the cause may lead you into territory which could expose you, because if things don't work out well, you may come to pay the price. So therefore, be sure that you've got it annotated, or you've got a letter of authorization, or whatever it might be. If it's a meeting, that there are minutes from the meeting to confirm that you have the authorization. I've told you many times in the past, Irving Bunim was such a communal activist, possibly the leading activist within the Orthodox community in America in the 50s and 60s into the 70s. He was a person of great charm, great achievement, great altruism, and possibly this lesson that he's mentioning, he may have either learned it himself the hard way or seen others who've learned it the hard way as well. So I quite like that. There's one more approach which I want to share with you, and it gives us a chance to end with a thought from the Kerem Hatzvi, but also with a story. And I often find it useful to illustrate an idea with a story. In this case, the story actually refutes the idea, but nevertheless, I hope you'll enjoy it all the same. So Kerem Hatzvi also has a nice drash, and he says, heavy zehirin bereshus, the word reshus can also be interpreted in another way completely. So far, the different interpretations are all related. The simple meaning is reshus, that is to say, authority, the governmental authority. That's the simple meaning. We suggested another meaning midrashically, which is reshus, permissible. Be cautious regarding behavior which is inherently permissible, but you can become drawn in and addicted to that kind of behavior. It can lead you from the permissible to the forbidden. The third one we just mentioned right now is, again, a drash, have a zehirin bereshus. If you're involved in communal leadership, be sure you have your mandate and your authorization from the community well established. But the fourth approach is, again, midrashic, homiletic, and it interprets the word bereshus in a completely different way. He suggests the word reshus can also be understood as related to the word rash. What does rash mean? Does anybody know what rash means? It's maybe counterintuitive. It doesn't mean like the word rosh, which is the head. That means something completely different. Any of our Hebraists? One of our leading Hebraists is Sam Walden, who has been coming to the Shiur recently, but I don't know if he's here tonight. Yeah, the word rash means impoverished. The word reish shin means impoverished. It says, tachanunim yedaber rash, a person who is impoverished, his prayers are very heartfelt because he's got nothing to lose and he has no other means, he has no resources to draw upon, so his prayers are heartfelt. Tachanunim yedaber rash. The word rash means impoverished. So he says, Havi zehirin bereshus, Rabbi Farber suggests an interpretation, be cautious not to become impoverished. So you say, well, who would want to become impoverished? Well, some people are very charitable. And the Talmud says that someone who is extremely charitable should still limit his largesse to a sustainable level. Because if a person gives and gives and gives, he may himself become impoverished as a result. And therefore, the Talmud says a person should give generously and all of that, but still in a measured fashion, lest he himself become impoverished, and then he'll be dependent on charitable largesse in his own right. So a person has to maintain his own needs and look after his own needs and that of his family as well, and give charitably in a generous fashion, in a lavish fashion, even, but not to the point of impoverishing himself. So he says the mission can be interpreted to mean, have his hearing shoes, don't become impoverished, because if you do so and you imagine, well, I've helped so many people, if I am myself in need, surely people will come to my aid. Surely, having been so generous when I had the means to do so, people will ensure that I am cared for and that my needs are met as well, and that if I have the need for a loan or for a grant, people will step forward and do that on my behalf. Says the Mishnah, it may be nice to imagine that, but don't be so confident, and don't distribute funds in an irrational way with the expectation or with the reliance that people will look after you, because the people who were so eager to enjoy your friendship when you are handing out the donations day and night, they may not stand by your side when in your own time of need. That's how he interprets it. Now, I think there's probably a lot of wisdom to that, and a certain cynicism as well, though, I think. And I'd like to just conclude, because the time is nearly up at 7:45, with 8:45, I'm sorry, 8:45, with a great little story that I read in a book about Beryl Wine. Rabbi Beryl Wine, Zuzan Gazut, lives in Israel now. He's still quite active, although he's advanced in years at this point. Rabbi Beryl Wine is from Chicago originally, and he was a Rav in Miami in the 1960s. And in that position, he was at that time young, he got to know the Panovizha Rav. The Panovizha Rav, Rabbi Yosef Kahaneman, was one of the great Torah personalities of the 20th century. Many years ago, in the year 2000 to be exact, 20 years ago, I gave a lecture, the men of the century. I had some women as well, not too many. Anyway, I had 10 great Torah personalities, Jewish personalities of the 20th century, and the Panovich Rav was one of them on my list. His name was Rabbi Yosef Kahaneman, and he traveled the world again and again, raising money for his yeshiva in Bnei Brak, raising money for many other Torah causes in the city of Bnei Brak and in Israel generally, and then in the Jewish world generally. There are still people, he died, I think, in 1968 or thereabouts, or 69 maybe. There are still people here in London who remember him, Panovich Rav. Rabbi Beryl Wine relates the following. He got a call from a member of his community. I've actually got the book here, so I don't need to read it to you, but I want to be able to repeat it faithfully. So at the age of 46 in 1928, there was a man called Mr. Frankel, which is just a pseudonym. He was a wealthy labor lawyer in New York City. And he became very successful by working all hours. It was in the 1920s. I just want to mention Dr. Schmidt again, can tell us about the roaring 20s, how a lot of people made money in the 20s till they all lost it all in the 30s, but in 1929. Anyway, in 1928, at the age of 46, this Mr. Frankel suffered a heart attack at the age of 46, lo aleinu. And the doctors told him that he's working much too hard, his blood pressure is high and everything else. He's been working day and night, and if he continues that way, he won't live in more than another 5 years. So he said that he decided that actually it's not worth, endangering my life for this. So he decided to sell up and to take his earnings and to retire to Florida. And so he did, and he bought an annuity at the time, a 40-year annuity. And in Miami Beach at that time, in the 1928, or whenever it was, he'd actually moved there, Miami Beach was just getting started as a city, etc. So Whatever he bought with his money, moving from Manhattan to Miami, he lived in a palatial estate and he lived very comfortably, and he involved himself in communal causes, charity work especially, and particularly the Panovich Yeshiva was his favorite charity. And when Beryl Wine moved there in the 1960s, so this Mr. Frankel, who at that time was 84 years old, was still very spry and very sprightly, and he came to davening all the time, and he was a very sort of exemplary senior member of the community. One day he gets a phone call from this Mr. Frankel, and he says, Rabbi, I'd love to have a chance to see you about a private matter. Anyway, Rabbi Wine went to his home. Rabbi Wine was probably in his 30s. The man was in his 80s. His housekeeper showed him in. He sat down in his study, looked around, a beautiful home, you know, one of the most prestigious homes in Miami Beach. The man said, Rabbi Wine, I have a serious problem. I'm now 85 years old. A terrible thing has happened to me. I've outlived my income. When I was a younger man, the doctors only gave me 5 years to live. So to be on the safe side, I bought 40 years of annuities. Now, annuities are not so fashionable anymore, but there was a time when they were very fashionable. Basically, without going into the complexity of it, which I don't really understand, basically, a person buys an annuity which pays him every year a certain amount. So he bought enough to live for 40 years in comfort. And I'm sure a Manhattan salary went a long way in Miami in those days. He said, the problem is now all my doctors are dead and my annuity has been spent. I've lived within my means, but beyond my years. So he says, I've got to sell my house. I've got to let my housekeeper go. For the last few years, I've been selling off my assets just to cover my living expenses. I'm living on Social Security, but it doesn't go far enough. So Rabbi Wine said to him, look, before you sell your house, you put your house on the market, the Panovich Rav is coming to town in whenever it was, a few weeks' time. I don't know if I forgot to say, but Beryl Wine, when he moved to Miami, he became the driver for the Panovich Rav. Whenever the Panovich Rav would come to Miami, however often it was when he was there, he drove him around, and he probably stayed for 2-3 weeks in those days. So he got to know him quite well and hear a lot of his stories. So he said to this Mr. Frankel, Panovich Rav is coming to town in a couple, whenever it was. Let's see if he has some advice for you. Anyway, let's get to the punchline of the story. Panovich Rav went to see him with Beryl Wine, with Rabbi Wine, and the man explained to the Panovich Rav the situation. So the Panovich Rav said to him, "No, this can't happen." He said, "It can't be." So Rabbi Wine started to explain to him the financial realities of life, but the rabbi, Rav Kahaneman, was steps ahead. He said, look, Mr. Frankel, he said, for many years you have supported the Panovich Yeshiva. It's time for the Panovich Yeshiva to support you. He put him on the payroll as a fundraiser, and the Panovich Yeshiva sent this man every month a salary. And for 2 more years, he lived in dignity. He did pass away at the age of 86 or 87, whatever it was. And in his will, he left the, I don't know if all of his estate or whatever, some generous amount, giving back to the Panovich Yeshiva as well. So the point here is that the one who gives also receives. And in this instance, the Panovich Rav felt that having been a beneficiary of this man's generosity for the support of Torah, it's time for the Torah to support him as well. And so it was. So this is an illustration which maybe represents the exception rather than the rule that Kerem Hatzvi mentions about how Zehirin Bereshus avoid poverty, because if a person falls to poverty, he won't necessarily have the assistance which he may deserve. It may not necessarily come his way. But at least in the case of this Mr. Frankel, as Rabbi Beryl Wine recounts, it certainly did, because the Panovich Rav stepped forward to recognize that the Torah that this man supported has a responsibility to support him as well. Thank you very much for participating in the Shiur tonight. And next week, we're on to a new Mishnah, a very interesting, fascinating Mishnah as well. I would look forward to seeing you there.